You've heard Toronto is unaffordable, but is that still true in 2025? Today, we're going to talk about interest rates, incomes, how those things come together to affect your affordability, and then what your affordability can buy you in Toronto and where. And let's not forget the rising costs of just living your life. Everything since COVID, going out to dinner, groceries, going to a concert, getting a beer at said concert, all those things have risen quite a bit over the past 5 years and are greatly affecting the affordability of people being able to buy homes in Toronto. So let's talk about what your money can actually get you in Toronto right now. But before we get there, let's start talking about interest rates. Interest rates were shot out of a cannon in March of 2022. We had never seen before that many increases in such a short period of time. So from March of 2022, peaking in July of 2023, before starting to come back down with cuts happening beginning June of 2024. As of right now, current discounted 5-year fixed rates probably look something like a high 3, so like 3.75, 3.79, 3.8 something, all the way up to potentially a mid 4, depending on who you're getting your mortgage with, who's offering what. When we look back over the last kind of 10 to 15 years, you'd have to go back to about 2010 before we see 5-year fixed rates at those same levels. So from, let's say, 2011 to now, interest rates have been, for the most part, lower than that. Obviously, with the exception of when the rates started to rise in March of 2022, going up to July of 2023. People who have been engaged in the real estate market over the past, again, 14, 15 years are seeing interest rates right now that they haven't seen as high, except for about 2010, and then also that short period of time from 2022 to 2023. So interest rates are still a bit of an impact. Now, what I will say is, for myself, I bought my first home in 2007, and I don't remember exactly when it was or what the rate was, but I do remember that it started with a 5. There was a period of time where interest rates were in the 4s, in the 5s, and that was totally normal. I know that I refinanced that property in 2010, I believe, and ended up doing something called a blended rate. And so was able to take that 5%, 5 and whatever change interest rate that I had and blend it with what their bank's current rates were, and ended up with something in the mid 4s. So, where we're at now is not totally unheard of, but again, it's just a bit higher than, what we've usually seen over the past 10-ish plus years. So what about incomes? Going back to around 2010, 2011, just to keep things kind of comparable, CMHC as a resource tells us that the average income in Toronto has risen 35%. The median income has risen 38%. So we've seen some decent gains in incomes, both average and median, over that same kind of 14-year period, as we've seen interest rates kind of fluctuate, but essentially be higher now compared to that 2010-2011 period. But how does that compare to your typical home prices? Since 2011, detached homes have risen in price, median, by 148%. Your typical semi-detached, so median price, again, has risen 150%. And condos have risen 90%. Again, all since 2011, those figures. So condos have gone up 90%. That's after your typical condo prices have kind of walked back, let's call it 20-ish% since peaking in February, March of 2022. So it would actually be 130% condos if we were currently filming this at the peak prices of condos in that period of 2022. So because of that rollback, we've seen your median price of a condo rise 90% since 2011. When you compare the rise in incomes with the rise in prices for your typical properties in Toronto, there's a massive discrepancy. And obviously that has led to the city becoming less and less affordable. Now, interestingly enough, in order to help with that lack of affordability, there's been a few things that have been put into place, some of them fairly recently, specifically with down payments, in order to kind of help people be able to, achieve the home prices that they're currently seeing, especially with those typical starter homes that we see, like your semi-detached 2-bed, 2-bath, 3-bed, 2-bath, those kinds of things. Prior to December of 2024, if you were buying anything that was valued at $1 million or more, you had to have had a 20% down payment. So that means that as soon as whatever it was that you were buying, didn't matter if it's a condo, house, whatever, if your offer price or your price that you agreed upon with the seller started with a 1 or higher, you must have a 20% down payment. So at $1 million, that's $200,000 as a down payment. At 1.5 million, that's $300,000, just as an example. What changed in this past December of 2024 is that bar got raised from $1 million to $1.5 million. So now you can have a minimum down payment up to 1.499999, and it doesn't have to be 20%. And then as soon as your price that you've paid for a property is 1.5 million or higher, then you must have 20% down. That is helping people who have the incomes to support homes, but they may not have the down payment funds required in order to, purchase properties at those prices. It's yet to be seen how much of an impact that's had on the market, how much that kind of change is actually introducing new buyers into the market. Because the reality is that you are purchasing something for, 1.4 million and you've got the minimum down payment. That's a pretty large mortgage. And at interest rates of, let's call it 4% or something like that, that is not an insignificant monthly payment. So, it's hard to know exactly who that kind of change is helping, but there's still time for that data to be collected and to see, okay, who has that helped? So now for what are the trends in the market? It absolutely is a tale of two different types of markets, one being the freehold market and one being the condo market. So freehold is any kind of property that doesn't have some kind of forced maintenance fee associated with it. So we're talking detached, semi-detached, row houses, those kinds of things. Even townhomes that are, what we call freehold, they don't have a maintenance fee. There are two metrics that I like to take a look at, and I'm not going to get into too much detail about them, but those two metrics are essentially showing the same kind of thing for either detached or semi-detached properties. Those are the two categories that I looked into. For detached homes, for the sales to new listing ratio, we're seeing a very slight kind of buyer's market, very slight buyer's market. And for semis, we're seeing actually a neutral or a balanced market for that sales to new listing ratio. When we look at the months of inventory, what we're seeing is a very slight seller's market for detached properties. And for semis, we're actually seeing a number that shows a really strong seller's market. So when I say that we're generally stable, that's kind of what I mean, because the sales to listing ratio and the months of inventory, the metrics that we look at that kind of try to capture supply and demand, which is generally what drives the market in Toronto, they're kind of showing somewhat conflicting things. One ratio says this, another ratio says that, and they're not terribly different from each other. But what I would say is that within the categories, detached or semi-detached, the months of inventory are generally showing the same thing, that the market is kind of favoring sellers. Within that sales to new listing ratio metric, both detached and semi are showing roughly the same kind of thing. Again, semi sort of balanced and a very slight buyer's market, almost balanced for detached. As far as prices are concerned, it was interesting that we actually saw a flattening of your median price for detached homes in Toronto between March and April. So March we saw a median price of 1.4 million, and in April we saw the exact same number. That's not totally out of this world, because what we typically see is both average and median sale prices kind of rising from January to February to March to April. But sometimes a peak can happen in February, sometimes it happens in March or April, but it's generally sometime in that spring market. Now, the past number of years, it's actually been February, but this year, 2025, it kind of feels like there's been a little bit of delay. And I don't know if it was because winter sucked. I don't know if it's because spring has taken its sweet time to get here. The spring market has been kind of pushed back a little bit. So again, detached, flattening of your median home price of 1.4 million from March to April. Now with semis, we saw actually a decline. So in March, your median sale price for a semi-detached home in Toronto was 1.25 million, and in April, it's 1.2. That's a little bit out of the ordinary, because again, more often than not, we see peaks in April or May as opposed to February and March. Although again, it has happened in February the past couple of years, but historically, we typically see everything peaking in April or May. That would be prices, that would be number of new listings, that would be amount of active inventory, and that also be number of sales. All those kind of things that we track usually peak in April or May. So definitely things are happening a little bit out of the ordinary. what else isn't in the world right around now, the Toronto real estate market is no different. Now, as I mentioned before, the condo market is a completely different story from the freehold market. We saw condo prices peak in March of 2022. From then until now, we're down, generally speaking, about 20-ish%. Now, it will depend on the location. It will depend even on the building. Some buildings are down more than that, but I feel good about saying, generally speaking, we're down about 20% in median price from the peak of March of 2022 to now. The question that I'm getting a lot recently is whether the condo market is going to get any better. When do I see that happening? Interestingly enough, we saw from March to April of 2025 a flattening of the median price. So the decline has, I don't want to say it stopped because it actually went down, but it went down by $1,000. So in March, the median sale price for any condo in Toronto was $620,000, and in April it was $619,000. So that's showing a little bit of stability. What I'm wondering is whether that trend will continue, whether we'll see maybe a little bit of a turning around of prices. My take is no. I don't believe that prices are going to start to go back up anytime soon, but it's a little bit of a sigh of relief, somewhat, for owners and sellers to see that median price hold a bit steady for those 2 months. Now, the two metrics that I talked about in the freehold market, so the sales to new listing ratio and the months of inventory, both are very firmly in the buyer's market camp for the condo market. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about what kind of market we're experiencing with condos. The sales to new listing ratio is at 23%. What that means is 23% of new listings that come on the market are selling. That means the other 77% are not, or they're sitting on the market, or they're being taken off. And the months of inventory is 7. And what that means is if there were no more new listings and we kept up with the rate of sales that happened in April and it persisted throughout the next months, the amount of inventory that we have on the market, it would take 7 months before that inventory would become sold out if no more new places hit the market. It's been a long time since we've seen a months of inventory number at 7 for anything. That's pretty telling of what kind of state the condo market is in right now in the city. Okay, so let's talk about what kinds of people might be buying properties in Toronto and what their incomes might look and what it would actually get them. So the first thing I want to do, and please bear with my penmanship, it is poor and has gotten more poor as I've gotten older and have done more and more things digital. Yes, it looks like a child is writing things. But in the freehold market, if we look at any kind of freehold property, so detached, semi-detached, freehold townhouses, row houses, those kinds of things, we have an overall median price of $1.3 million. Okay. Now, the minimum down payment that you can use, so I'm going to put minimum down. The least that you can put down at that price point is $105,000. That will end up getting you a mortgage amount, okay, total mortgage of around $1.24 million. Now you might be thinking, hey, wait a second. If I take 1.3 million and subtract 105,000, I do not get 1.24. I would end up at 1,195,000. That is because if you put less than 20% as a down payment, you have to pay something called CMHC insurance. It is insurance for the mortgage lender, so for the bank, not for you, for the bank that's giving you the mortgage, that insures your mortgage so that if something were to happen, to you with your employment, something like that, that the bank is safe, essentially. So you end up with a total mortgage amount of that, and the income that you need to support that amount is $262,000. So that's a lot. That could be a single person. They're obviously making great income. That is more likely two people who have roughly equal amounts. And again, it doesn't have to be. But if we think back to what I mentioned, actually I did not mention that the median income in 2023, I can't remember the numbers that I got from CMHC, it was 2023, maybe 2024, but the median income in Toronto, roughly right now, is $129,000. So $129,000 times 2 would get you $258,000. That's pretty darn close to the amount of income that would be needed to support a $1.24 million mortgage. So, that is probably two people making around the median income, just as an example, to support that. Now, what if, that's if you have the minimum down payment. What if you had 20%? So if 20%, then what happens is your minimum down payment changes to $260,000. So it obviously goes up by quite a bit. So you go from 105 to 260. That's an increase of $155,000. But watch this. Your mortgage goes down to $1,040,000 roughly. Your down payment had to go up by $155,000, but your mortgage went down by a little over $200,000. That means that CMHC insurance in this price point was costing you a little over $40,000. It's in your best interest, if you can, to get the 20% down payment so that you can avoid paying the CMHC insurance. Now, in some cases, and I'm not a mortgage broker, but in some cases, and I would ask you to speak to your bank representative, speak to your mortgage broker or whatever, but in some cases, when you have 20% or more as a down payment and you do not require the insurance, banks actually might give you not as good of a rate because they don't have insurance anymore. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on, is at what rate do you qualify if you're not taking insurance versus at what rate do you qualify if you are taking CMHC insurance. Now, the income that you would need in order to support that $1,040,000 in mortgage is $232,000. Now, I'm making some assumptions. I had to make some assumptions on interest rate. I had to make some assumptions on property taxes as well. And property taxes is something that you do not want to sleep on because, for a $1.3 million house, your property taxes could be $6,000-$7,000 a year. We're talking, between $500 and $600 a month. That's not an insignificant cost. So don't sleep on what property taxes are going to end up costing you. Now, let's move to the condo market. Like in the freehold market, I'm just going to give you an example. There are all kinds of different price points that are available to you. I just used the median price of freehold of 1.3, and I'm going to do the same with condo. So right now, the median price for kind of any condo right now is $619,000. I mentioned that before. And so if you put the minimum down payment, that is $37,000. That's a little bit more reasonable than what you'd need if you were buying a $1.3 million house, of course. Your mortgage amount, again, because you are putting less than 20% down, you need CMHC insurance. Your mortgage amount is going to be about $605,000. And the income needed to support that amount of mortgage is $134,000. Now, when you are looking at your affordability for condos, and again, you're going to want to work with your bank or your mortgage broker, there is a factor that needs to be included, and that would be maintenance fees. So because they're a forced cost to you every month, that will affect your affordability. So make sure that you are speaking with your mortgage professional, whoever that may be, in order to kind of factor that into the equation. Now, let's say that you are able to have a 20% down payment. Okay, so then the price doesn't change. Your minimum down payment, if you've got 20%, is now going to be $124,000. Your mortgage amount is going to be $495,000. And the income needed to support goes down to $112,000. And that's below that median income that we talked about, the reports or the figures from CMHC. So, that's obviously a little bit more reasonable, but we're talking about a purchase price in the $600,000 price range as opposed to 1.3. So it obviously is going to be very different, but condos are doable for a single person, again, depending on their income. So that's all fine and well. Here's what my income supports from a mortgage standpoint and etc. But like, what does that get me? So what I want to do is show you, just using Realm, which is what, agents in Toronto use to search properties, and what we can give our access to with our clients. We can give our clients kind of this backdoor access to realtor.ca as well through Realm. So what I did is I've got a map, of most of Toronto up here, kind of spanning from, let's say, Etobicoke, maybe early Mississauga, going all the way to like Scarborough, basically. And then, roughly 401-ish, you can see a bit of space up here by the airport. The only filters that I have right now are freehold properties, $1 million or less. And what I want you to notice is the massive kind of open gap in the middle of the city, basically the core for the most part. There's a couple of little dots over here down by the DVP. But nothing in Midtown, nothing in North Toronto, Lawrence Park, etc. Nothing over in like Little Italy, Little Portugal, Roncy, High Park, that kind of stuff. You have to go to the kind of, I wouldn't say northwest, but like sort of northwest of the core, junction-ish. But what I can assure you is that anything that's in the junction under $1 million is probably not in very good shape, or it's very small, or it's, name your undesirable, right? So it could be a combination of them. Now, if I zoom in, you'll see that a few other places kind of crop up. The system can only show so many properties at one time. So zooming in kind of can, release, I guess, if you will, some other places. So basically like, between St. Clair and, the Allen-ish, although it doesn't extend below Eglinton, as you know, but, St. Clair and let's call it Oakwood, in and around that area, kind of extending north to just north of Eglinton. And then if you go west from there, you'll find a fair number of smaller bungalows. Some are 2-bed, some are 3-bed. The 3-beds are going to be more expensive, but certainly up in that region is where you could potentially find properties under $1 million. Again, a lot of them are going to be probably in rough shape. Now, if I zoom over to the east side, the further east you go, you can see that like the density of cluster of spots kind of it increases the further east that you go, but you'll still find the odd place in like, Leslieville-ish, or, what they call Upper Beaches. Depends on who's watching this video and gets upset for calling it Upper Beaches. But, Leslieville, for example, is a very good neighborhood. And so properties that are going to be in around that, under that $1 million price point are probably going to be small, again, rough shape. They could be like backing onto the tracks or something like that. But they exist. Now, the other thing I want you to bear in mind is that a lot of these places, especially the ones that you see listed at $999, $799, $899, those are properties that very likely will probably have an offer night planned. So, $999 is actually a place that where the seller and their representative are looking for $1.2 million. Places that are listed at $799, they're probably looking for something that starts with a 9 or maybe even a 1. So not all these are real necessarily, but it's what's on the market right now. Now, if I change the price and I say, okay, let's say it's a minimum of $1 million and 1, just to eliminate anything that we already kind of took a look at. And then let's say up to 2, now we're going to start to see some properties pop up in, Davisville, Lee Side, up into kind of the Lawrence Park area. You'll see a lot more there. And then as you scroll down and we look at, some very popular kind of like downtown-ish neighborhoods like, Bluerdale or Junction, Roncy, Little Italy, Little Portugal, in and around like Trinity Bellwoods, you'll see places that are, currently available in those price range. So you need to be, if you want to search for, what is that price range, because I can go lower than 2, obviously, it's probably 1.3-ish, and you can find places that are a little bit less than that. Again, some of these properties are going to have offer nights, but it almost absolutely has to start with a 1 in order to be in some of those kind of prime neighborhoods. If we switch to condos, so what I've done is I'm going to zoom out, and with condos, I've done the price point right now between 300 and 850, and it almost kind of looks like there's not much, especially on this west side. First of all, the west side doesn't have a ton of condos to begin with. Second of all, I told you that my system the realm can only show so many properties on the market at once. So, if you look at Midtown, for example, here it is, Yonge and Eglinton's right there, and it looks like there's not much on the market, and there's a huge cluster of places downtown. But if I zoom in, specifically on Midtown, just as an example, then you can see that cluster actually grows now that the system says, oh, okay, you're only looking in this area, show me everything that's available. And so in condos at almost any price point, like within reason, so I would say 500-ish and up, the world is your oyster. There are so many condos on the market right now. It is ridiculous. So, anywhere where there are condos to be sold, if you've got a decent budget, you'll be able to find something for sale. Again, if I scroll in on the Junction area, you can see there's just not a lot on the market, but that's because there's just not a lot of condos to be had. If you, generally speaking, your dollar needs to stretch a little bit further, generally speaking, you just need to look a little bit further from the core in any direction, north, east, south, or west. Now, sometimes going in those directions, for example, if you go west, especially in the freehold market, you get to a place like Oakville or certain pockets of Mississauga, are actually going to be more expensive than certain neighborhoods kind of closer to the core. So it does depend a little bit, but generally speaking, if you go in any direction away from the core, your dollar will go further. So bear that in mind. Now, to help you with all of this, to figure out, okay, well, what is my affordability, all that kind of stuff, a couple different things. Don't sleep on getting involved with a mortgage broker. I like mortgage brokers more so than bank professionals. I'm going to cover that in another video, but definitely have them help you with what your affordability is. They go into a lot of detail as to what your income and assets versus your debts and how that all plays into, what can I actually afford? What would I actually get pre-approved for? What would a lender allow me to buy, so to speak? A tool that I love and that I basically used for all of the research that I did for this video is the Canadian Mortgage app, or it might be called the Canada Mortgage app. The logo is a house with a little Canadian maple leaf coming out of the chimney. I'm not affiliated with them. I don't have any kind of sponsorship or anything like that, but it's a great tool. It's got everything that you need from figuring out, how the stress test applies to you for getting a pre-approval, your income requirements, to your purchase calculator, how much down payment do I need, what's the minimum, all that kind of stuff, land transfer tax calculators. It's all right there. So it's great. I'm not going to direct you to my website. I don't have any of those calculators because I just think that they're easily accessible anywhere you want. You certainly can use any bank's website and they're going to have some kind of affordability calculator on there. So, check that out as well. You can just kind of Google very simply Canada or Toronto affordability calculator and away you go. If you are feeling like you are struggling with affordability, there are some tools that are available to you and some strategies that are available to you to potentially help. One would be purchasing with others. If you look at the amount of income required to support a certain amount of mortgage, and if it's in the 200 and something thousand and you make 100 and something thousand, well, bringing on somebody else on board could help, potentially double that income or more. Co-buying with somebody is certainly an option. You could have a discussion potentially with family members about doing something called a living inheritance. So, if people were planning on passing some funds along to you, potentially after they passed, if they've got some, something saved up and they have the ability to gift it to you while you're alive to help you with the purchase, that could be an option. And the other one is to make sure that you take advantage of things like the first-time home buyer's savings account. There are other tools like the RSP. So being able to, sock money away, getting tax rebates for it, as well as being able to pull it out and use it towards purchasing tax-free. Those are some great tools as well. Buying in Toronto is doable. It's hard, obviously. You have to strategize, you have to plan, and sometimes you need to think outside of the box. If you are looking for some help with how to make your next move, I would encourage you to reach out. You can find all my contact information in the description, or you'll find a link in the video where you can book a consultation. No strings attached. We can just have a conversation about what your situation is, what kind of help you need. You probably have questions. I used to be a teacher. I'm not bad at helping people understand certain kind of topics of conversation and certain points with relative ease. I would encourage you to click that link, book a consult with me, or just reach out and send me an email. I'm Jamie Harnish. I'm with Bosley Real Estate. I operate in the city of Toronto, and I would love to hear from you and help you with your move. Thanks, and take care.